Hey guys, live from GenreBlast. I am here with writer, director, possibly animator.
Yeah.
Behind the two shorts that are playing this weekend, it is Popcorn and Metamorphosis. Well, my first question for you, I just want to make sure I get it right.
Sure.
Because the spelling of these, by the way, this is Jonathan Riles. I realized I jumped right into that.
All good.
The spelling of these two shorts is kind of unique. So are they pronounced like regular, like you would like popcorn and like metamorphosis?
That's a very good question. So yes, I mean, I like the idea of the audience pronouncing it however they want to, but my intent was for it to be called popcorn. And the way I sometimes say it is emphasis on each word. So like pop, corn, rather than popcorn, because it's talking about two different objects rather than, popcorn that you get at the movies. The idea that where I come from in the Midwest in Ohio, soda or cola is pronounced, we call it pop. It's just kind of our term for it. So the idea that it's actually soda and then the vegetable or fruit corn. So it's pop, corn. So it's like these two unlike comestibles, these materials that are like kind of combining into this monstrosity of a weird thing. And then with metamorphosis, I structured the spelling that way to kind of bring in the idea that within the film, the actual text title shifts depending on where the narrative is at. So I wanted to just isolate and emphasize that I part of it, but also like draw attention to the pun at the same time. And I really, it's been a really fun, weird journey too, because especially with documenting things like this on IMDb, the title sequence isn't always accepted. So I've literally like emailed them back and forth like, no, it has to be spelled this way. I know this doesn't go align with your guidelines and everything, but it has to. I've had to submit some of those titles 2 or 3 times. And that's what I'm really trying to bring to the idea of titling is weird titles. But especially like living in the digital age where you want the first time somebody types in your film for it to be like the first one there.
Yeah.
So trying to create these unique characters within spelling, it's also just a strategy where I'm just trying to like get that first click. I know that might sound like, well, I want to get it, but like, especially living in the internet age, the different way that we document movies. So those are kind of the main points I wanted to kind of draw in with the weird ways I spelled it. No.
I will provide the correct spelling and titling in the show notes below, wherever you guys are currently watching this. But one of the things that I really liked about these two shorts is emphasis on shorts. So Popcorn is just under a minute and Metamorphosis is a little over 3 minutes, but there's so much detail. Starting with Popcorn, there's so much detail that is like in such this bite-sized like short film. And it's not very often that we get to talk about animation shorts on here. So can you kind of talk about the challenge of crunching in so much in such a short period of time?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you described it as bite-sized. That's like a great way of saying it, especially with it being like a food movie. I love that description. I'm going to use that. Especially,
you heard it here first.
Yeah. Especially with the idea of popcorn, it really, one of the inspirations for it was like pop animations, like really quick, fast-paced kind of things. And I was like, if this is a brief idea or it pops in very quickly, the idea of it being 1 minute actually, I think, works a little bit more just based on the nature of it kind of going in and going out. Again, that pop art, pop animation look. And both of these shorts were actually ones that I created in my studio when I was getting my graduate degree at the Columbus College of Art and Design. So I think, and it's not that you can't make work like outside of academia. Of course you can. But when you're pursuing something like an MFA or a Master of Fine Arts, they really, really emphasize you just sitting in your studio and thinking and conceptualizing and just sitting there. And I had my tiny little cubicle, but I had 3x5 index cards all over my wall regarding storyboarding. So just really sitting there and thinking like, okay, maybe I want to get at least 5 layers of ideas into this thing or this thing. And it's also interesting the way that like you take a 1 minute animation versus a 3.5 minute animation and the different levels of like craft and things. So popcorn to animate and film, because it's kind of a mixed media piece, it took about 5 weeks.
Jeez.
And in my MFA, that 5 weeks was one critique, one studio project. So that was like at the end of my 5 weeks, I would present it, and that was the finished product. And I'm like, I think based on what I can do, I think I can only do 1 minute in that 5 week time, versus Metamorphosis took about 7 months. But it was kind of this thing where I started it in the spring, kind of worked on it over the summer, and then really August of 2022, I'm like, okay, I think this is where I want it. I'm going to try to send it out to the festival circuit. But, you know, there's a lot more stop motion in Metamorphosis. There's a lot more like crafty, like physical labor, hands-on stuff. So it just depends on, you know, what you're talking about. But the different, what you're talking about, like the different layers of conceptualization, I think just has to do with me being in grad school and just sitting in my studio trying to figure out the meaning of life, or whatever that means, or what it actually all means. How do these different puzzle pieces that I've got thrown out on my desk kind of come together in a fun way?
Yeah, it's interesting to like talk about these because I imagine that like for popcorn, for instance, you said that like there's emphasis on the words pop and corn, and it kind of almost seems like, you know, you started with a idea of saying, all right, how many different times can we interpret these words? And then for Metamorphosis, the I is the real big thing, to where like that I keeps like shifting in like different words. And it kind of looks like you said, all right, how many times or how many other different words can I essentially break down into these the different takes on this word?
Yeah, I love words. Words are so fun, and I am the dad jokes guy of my family. So like I will walk in the door and I will try to say a funny pun, and they're like, "Oh, Jonathan's entered the room."
Yeah.
And so I like to push it to where it is quote unquote cheesy, or like I said, like dad joke realm kind of thing, because I think that humor is a fun like engagement tool. And whether an audience likes your piece, or if they don't like it, or if they're disgusted by it, a laugh versus a "oh, really," that's still a level of interaction. If someone's like, "Oh, that's so cheesy," they're still recognizing that it's cheesy.
Yeah.
So I like to use it as like an engagement tool, and like I also have a weird process where I want to make my work scarier, but it always ends up more on the humor side of things. So like popcorn was like one of the scarier things I've made, and I showed it to like my MFA class, and they just laughed. And I'm like, okay, you know what? Humor is valid. Humor can work in everything, but I think humor and horror are kind of distant cousins at the same time, and they kind of go hand in hand with everything. But that's another thing that I really want to play with, is this idea of, can we make graphic design movies? Can the narrative, if you would call it that, can that actually be the content to where we take a journey and text playing a big, big role in it? I tried to kind of bring that into Metamorphosis, but you know, is it the text that's influencing the character, or is the character doing something and the text is just reinforcing the idea of the change? And so I'm still kind of learning like what can be done with text that reinforces some kind of concept, and are they independent? Do they work together, and that sort of thing?
One of the things that I imagine for the process of creating this is the fact that you're kind of like a one-man army, essentially. What separates our publication from other rounds out there is that we discuss mental health when we're talking about artistry. And I got to imagine for something that is as complex as these films are, for as like short as they are, what were some of the ways that you, as a creator, kept from kind of, you know, having broken mental health, or you know, kind of jumping into the realm of like burnout, or like, you know, what was kind of the drive to keep going to make these movies?
That's a really good question. I do think that I was making these shorts in one of the busier times of my life where, like I said, I was in grad school, which is a boat in itself, like to cross that, ocean and everything. I mean, I was also working full time through like my GA ship, through my college. And the thing about this particular time was that like you work just to make a living, but then if you're, pursuing something that's aligned like an art residency in grad school, they expect you to do 20 hours a week of studio work, just independent. And you have to sometimes in some programs log that. Yeah. So it's like, okay, I'm working full time and then I've got an extra 20 hours on here. I also had like a 40-minute commute to my, and so it's all about, like, it's a very surface level way of thinking about it, like money and time.
Yeah.
And so I tried to find ways to like use that to the best of my ability. Like, as weird as this might sound, my drive home was like my cool down. Yeah. Where I wouldn't, call any of my friends. I wouldn't think about anything. I would just listen to music, drive down the road, and then when I got home, I would start to think, okay, what are the steps for the next day? But it's just like finding the moments and I don't think that we take those moments for granted all the time, but just those moments where you can find ways to make the most of the time. Because I also I'm a night owl. So like, I think that there is a way that procrastination and being a night owl kind of goes hand in hand. So like having like a really, really hard day, but then going into the night and falling into these worlds where I'm like, okay, here I am, I'm going to try to just do my own thing in my basement under my animation table and just kind of get lost in that world. But then you sacrifice things like sleep and everything. Yeah. So I don't think it's ever like a perfect process, but I've just found that like finding ways to manage your time makes it feel more valuable in the end.
Yeah. I mean, like, I've definitely gone through periods. I'm lucky to have a team and a network of a board behind us now that help create content, but I've definitely gone through those periods where like I've been a sole content creator before jumping into this publication, and I mean it sucks sometimes, and that's one of the things that I think the work that these two films just is spectacular. They're haunting and like beautiful, but like, and the reason I say it's haunting is because like I'm a huge David Lynch fan.
Oh, same. Yes.
Lynch is like is my favorite filmmaker of all time. Yeah. And if you're like a hardcore Lynch fan, you know like his animation and his short films are like super experimental, and I think that's a lot of the stuff that I like got. That's the kind of the impression I got from this, is like that there's like an experimental edge to this. So my last question for you would be like, when it comes to like the experimental side of filmmaking, how do you keep reinventing yourself from short to short?
Wow. Yeah, that's another big thing to think about. By the way, before I answer your question, I literally have like a David Lynch book I'm reading. It's back at my hotel.
Like, it's awesome. In my book bag. That's awesome.
So like it's his transcendental meditation book. So I'm like learning about like his whole thing with that, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
But reinventing with everything, I think that's one of the reasons why I'm here at GenreBlast is this idea that I really like that this festival is a niche, but the idea of what genre is still evolving. Like, we've got, at least from what I've seen so far, like horror, fantasy, sci-fi, just those three things can be blended in whatever way. Yep. And so it's like, I kind of do want to venture away from like the comedy and do something a little bit more, even more absurd or a little bit more scary. But it also is interesting that like there is a kind of acceptance to this content in like a place where all these different genre movies are being done. Yeah. So it's like, I think the main thing that I'm thinking about right now is I've done things that are abstract. I've done things that are narrative. Do I combine them, or do I just maybe pick a polarizing point of those two different sides of the scale and like hit it really, really, really hard on the head? One of the first films that I ever did was this film called The Amber Thief, and it was a poem animation. And it was completely based on this poem where I would go through and tell this story, and there was a voiceover. One of the reasons I wanted to do Metamorphosis in the way that I did is I wanted there to be no dialogue telling the story, but just a single word. So it's like, okay, maybe the next step would be to remove the words entirely.
Yeah.
And just like, I really do try to engage with like reinventing and what's the next big thing, because, and you never know what it's going to be. Like one day you're going to wake up and it's like, I'm going to make a movie about a sunflower. And like, or like just like, that's what I do is I like to find weird objects and see if I can find a narrative around that. But just, I like to go window shopping sometimes and just look into the window. I'm like, that's an interesting kite design. It looks like a hummingbird. Like, you know, those are the kind of things that I look to really get that first spark of a new idea.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I thank you guys. It premieres. It is making, I guess it's in GenreBlast today. Where can people find you online and possibly follow your unique filmmaking?
Well, thank you, Josh. I am on Instagram, just my first last name, Jonathan Riles. My website is called shellusterstudios.com. That's kind of like my little basement studio where I do.
Mouthful.
Yeah, so it's to break it down, it's shell like a seashell, and then luster as in like a sparkle. Gotcha. So shell luster, like a sparkling shell. But it's shellusterstudios.com. That's my little brand. I do logo designs, graphic design, a little bit of animation, end credit sequence designs. There's like a tab on my website where on Shell Luster Studios where it has my bio and everything. But I'm on Instagram all the time, Facebook. So right now that's where I am online. So
all right, dope. Well, we'll provide links for that for Jonathan and Shell Luster Studios in the show notes below. Jonathan, thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you, Josh. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, and you guys can check out, be on the lookout for both of these films because they are a lot of fun. They're really weird, and we celebrate weird cinema here at Victims and Villains. So thank you guys for watching. Hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back with more Genre Blast.